There are places in this world that exist just beyond the edge of what most of us ever get to see. Not the beaches on postcards. Not the cities in travel magazines. The places tucked behind iron doors and down winding staircases. The places where the rules of ordinary life simply don't apply. And the stories we carry back from those places, if we're lucky enough to carry them back at all, are the ones that stay with us for the rest of our lives. The ones we whisper about at the dinner table. The ones we keep locked away until our grandchildren are old enough to truly understand what it means to be human in a world that is far bigger, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any of us ever expected to be. Tonight, we have 3 of those stories. 3 accounts from 3 very different travelers, in 3 very different corners of the world, each of them ordinary people who stepped a little too far off the beaten path and found themselves face to face with something they were never meant to witness. A young Irish woman backpacking through Morocco in the early 1970s. A gap-year student from England who stumbled into something unspeakable beneath the streets of Yangon, Myanmar. And a young American traveler on the beaches of Sri Lanka, whose night ended in the sand with a stranger's hands around his throat. These aren't ghost stories. They aren't made up. They are the kinds of things that happen in the real world, in the shadows that most tourists never see. And what makes them so deeply unsettling is not the extraordinary nature of the events themselves, it's how close to ordinary everything felt, right up until the moment it wasn't. So settle in. Take a breath. And before we begin, if you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to the channel. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Because trust me, you are going to want to come back for more. Now, let's begin. Story 1. So, a little while ago, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my 2 teenage granddaughters, the kind of afternoon that stretches out comfortably with nowhere particular to be, and somehow the conversation turned to travel. One of them, the bolder of the 2, naturally, suggested that the desire to wander, to pick up and go somewhere brand new and unknown, was a pretty modern invention. Something dreamed up by cheap airline tickets and the endless scroll of Instagram posts showing beautiful young people in sun-drenched paradise, sipping something colorful from a coconut with their toes in the sand. And I agreed with her, up to a point. I genuinely did. It is remarkably easy to develop a hunger for adventure when your phone is filled wall to wall with videos of people kayaking between tropical islands, or hiking steep mountain trails up to Machu Picchu with the clouds rolling in below their feet. That kind of content makes the world feel both enormous and surprisingly reachable at the same time, and I completely understand the pull of it. But I also wanted her to know that the wanderlust, that restless, beautiful, sometimes reckless itch to go somewhere new, it has always been part of us. Long before anyone had a smartphone or a social media account, people only needed to unfold a map or listen to a sailor's tale from some far corner of the globe to feel that same tug deep in their chest. The desire to board a ship and sail toward the unknown horizon is as old as humanity itself. And in my own youth, I felt that pull just as strongly as any young person scrolling through travel content today. My granddaughters, naturally, could barely believe it. The idea that their sweet old Irish granny had once packed a bag, walked out of Dublin, and gone off alone to see the world was almost too much for them to wrap their heads around. But it was true. Every word of it. I had been to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, and I had stories from all of those places. Wonderful stories, funny stories, stories full of color and warmth and people I still think about to this day. But there was one story I had kept to myself all those years. Kept it sealed away, tucked into a quiet corner of my memory that I didn't visit very often. I had always told myself I'd share it with them someday, when they were old enough. When they were approaching the age of real travel, real independence. Old enough to truly understand what it means. And sitting there at that kitchen table, I finally decided that day had arrived. I left Dublin in 1971. I was 19 years old, full of energy and ideas, and absolutely certain that the world was out there waiting for me. My first stop was London, where I found a job and used the money I earned to fund the journey ahead. While I was there, I did all the things you're supposed to do, Buckingham Palace, Big Ben, the whole performance. It was lovely. And then from London, I made my way to Paris. In Paris, I managed to find a job in a little Irish bar, the kind of place that always seems to exist in European cities regardless of how far you are from the Emerald Isle, and I stayed there for a while doing exactly what I had done in London, working, saving, exploring in every spare hour I had. Then I moved on to Spain. Now, Spain was beautiful in a way that almost knocked the wind out of me. The food was extraordinary, every meal a little event in itself, and the light in the evenings had this golden quality that made everything look like it was worth painting. My original plan had been to travel from Spain into the south of France and then work my way east toward Italy. I had always wanted to see Rome, see the ancient ruins and the artwork I had read about in school. Greece was on the list too, those white and blue islands that looked like something out of a dream. But then I reached the Straits of Gibraltar. I stood at the edge of the water and looked out, and there on the other side, just a few miles across the narrow strip of blue, was Morocco. Just sitting there, visible and real and impossibly close. And something happened inside me in that moment. I can't explain it in any tidy way. It was like the place was calling to me across the water. Rome and Athens would always be there. I could read about them in every library on earth. But Morocco, the food, the music, the people, the whole landscape of the culture, was a complete and total mystery to me. And when I thought about it that clearly, the decision made itself. I turned away from Italy. I got on a ferry. And off to Morocco I went. I arrived in Tangier after a rough overnight crossing on the ferry, the kind of journey that leaves you feeling like you've been slowly turned inside out. Then came a bus ride that was, if anything, even rougher, rattling and lurching along roads that seemed to have been designed as an obstacle course. I had grown up in Dublin, a proper city, and I thought I understood what busy and noisy and overwhelming meant. But the moment I stepped off that bus at the main station in Tangier, I realized I had understood nothing of the sort. The second I set foot on the pavement, men were surrounding me and the other passengers from every direction, each one with something to offer: hotels, taxi rides, hashish, tour guides, you name it. One man actually grabbed hold of my bag, not to steal it, I think, but to carry it for me, expecting a tip in return. I had to shout and push him away before he'd let go, and some of the other men nearby burst out laughing at him and said something in Arabic that I could only assume was teasing. It wasn't a threatening moment exactly, but it was an intense one, and it told me immediately that Tangier was not going to be a gentle or quiet experience. The intensity never really dropped after that. The old city, the Medina, was unlike anything I had ever stepped inside. It was a maze, and that's not an exaggeration, a labyrinth of narrow white-walled streets that twisted and turned unpredictably, with brightly colored laundry strung on lines overhead, flapping in the warm breeze like signal flags. The marketplaces were absolute bedlam, but the beautiful, thrilling kind. There were enormous sacks of spices everywhere you looked, mounded high, vivid saffron, rust-red paprika, deep earthy cumin, with pyramids of oranges and lemons adding their brightness to the whole picture. Copper pots and trays and trinkets caught the light and threw it back in tiny sparks. Rugs of extraordinary complexity and beauty were draped over low walls and doorways, and I knew before I'd been there a day that I would be taking one home with me. The whole place was underscored by the constant sound of haggling, a kind of musical back and forth between buyers and sellers that filled every alleyway and courtyard, and it only paused, completely and reverently, when the call to prayer rang out from the minarets, rolling over the flat rooftops in that haunting, ancient sound that I will never in my life forget. The smells were overwhelming in the very best sense. Everywhere you walked, the air was heavy with cumin and cinnamon and ginger. And then in certain pockets and corners, you'd catch a whiff of something else entirely, something heady and almost oily, which I later learned was the smoke from burning hashish drifting through from somewhere nearby. I developed a real taste for the sweet mint tea that seemed to be available on every corner, and I had my favorite spots to drink it. Café Baba, up on the hill with a view over the city, and Café Hoffa, right on the edge of the cliff above the water, where you could sit for hours with a glass of tea and watch the world drift past below. In the evenings, the great square in the center of the city came alive with a different kind of energy, acrobats and storytellers and snake charmers. All performing to shifting crowds of wide-eyed tourists and locals who'd seen it all 1,000 times but still watched with quiet amusement. I'd eat dinner for less than $1, a bowl of tajin or a plate of couscous, rich and warming and perfect, and when I finally couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, I'd make my way back to the hostel where I'd been staying since the day I arrived. It was a simple place, no pretensions about it. 2 dormitories, one for men and one for women, each with mattresses laid out for roughly 12 people. There was a little footlocker at each bed for valuables, and shared bathroom facilities down the hall. It was a place to sleep, nothing more and nothing less. But when you are 19 and the whole of Morocco is waiting outside the door, that is absolutely everything you need. The kinds of guests who suffered most in the mornings were, reliably, the ones who had mixed alcohol and hashish the night before. Bad hangovers were almost a feature of dorm life, and I became quite skilled at moving through my morning routine with the silent efficiency of a mouse, showering, dressing, collecting my things, all without making a sound that might disturb whoever was still groaning into their pillow. One night I came back to the dormitory quite late. The room was dark and quiet. And there was a figure on one of the mattresses, completely covered from head to toe by a blue sheet. I assumed, without giving it a second thought, that it was someone who'd had a particularly heavy night and was sleeping it off. We've all been there, or at least we've all seen it. I didn't think anything more of it. The next morning, the figure was still there. Still covered entirely by that blue sheet. Still motionless. I moved through my routine as quietly as I always did, giving the sleeping figure the same courtesy I gave everyone, and then headed out into the city for what turned out to be another remarkable day. I'd been thinking about heading down to Marrakesh for a couple of days, so I visited the bus station to ask about tickets. Then I returned to the hostel with plans to shower and rest for a while before the evening. But when I came around the corner and approached the entrance, there were 2 police cars parked outside. I slowed down, studying them as I walked closer, unsure what to make of it. As I walked through the door, one of the officers called out something to me in Arabic, sharp and authoritative. I didn't speak the language, but the meaning was clear enough. I stopped and turned around. The hostel owner was on the far side of the lobby, speaking quietly to one of the other girls from my dorm room, a Dutch girl, I think, and it looked like he was trying to comfort her. His English was excellent, built up over years of hosting international travelers. He excused himself from the girl and came over quickly to explain. Tangier at that time had a significant issue with drug smuggling. Backpackers, people who looked exactly like me, were occasionally used as couriers, carrying hashish back to Europe where it could be sold for enormous profit. The local police tolerated people smoking it, more or less, but they were far less forgiving about smuggling. There were stories circulating among travelers about backpackers being stopped, searched, and sometimes arrested if they were carrying too much and didn't have enough cash to negotiate their way out of the situation. I thought that must be what this was. It fit the picture, solo traveler, young, foreign. I assumed they'd want to search my bag. But instead of asking to go through my belongings, the police began asking me questions about where I had been the previous evening. The owner translated patiently back and forth. The officers wanted to know my movements, what I had done, who I had spoken to. And most specifically, they wanted to know if I had had any interaction with one of my dorm mates, a French girl whose name I couldn't quite bring back to mind. Something like Molina, or Selina, or perhaps Celine, I was never entirely sure. They asked whether we had spoken and what had been said between us. I told them honestly that I had barely spoken to anyone I was staying with. Girls from all across Europe were passing through that dorm constantly, staying a night or 2 and moving on. I wouldn't have known which one they were asking about even if I'd tried. Then one of the officers asked me how I had slept the previous night. I didn't understand why that was relevant, and I said so. And then he asked me whether I had noticed anything that morning. Anything unusual in the dormitory room. And in that moment, everything I had filed away without examination came flooding back all at once. The blue sheet. The absolute stillness of the figure beneath it. The fact that they had not moved at all through the night, had not gotten up once to use the bathroom or to get a drink of water. The fact that when I left in the morning, they were still in exactly the same position. Nobody sleeps like that. Nobody lies completely still for 9 hours in the heat of a Moroccan summer without moving even once. Not unless they are dead. The realization hit me like cold water. I had spent the night sleeping just a few feet away from a dead body. Not only that, but I had woken up, moved through my entire morning routine, and walked right out of that room without understanding for a single second what was actually there beneath that blue sheet. I started to panic, and it built quickly. I had slept next to a dead girl. I had showered and dressed and gone about my morning without a thought for her. And now, from the way the police were looking at me, from the specific nature of the questions they were asking, it felt very much like they considered me a possible suspect. They asked if I would accompany them to the station to answer further questions, and I agreed, because what else could I do? The hostel owner was kind enough to come along with me to translate. At the station, I found several of the other hostel guests already there, seated on the hard plastic chairs of what passed for a waiting area. They hadn't put any of us in cells. They just wanted to ask their questions. And when they asked me mine, I broke down. Not because I was afraid they'd blame me for what had happened, though that fear was certainly present, but because of the girl herself. Because of the fact that she had died in that room, feet away from people who had no idea, who had gone on sleeping without knowing, and who had walked out the next morning without a backward glance. The guilt of that, even though there was nothing I could have done, was crushing. The police eventually confirmed that it was a murder. They didn't tell us how. But apparently my reaction, and the reactions of the other girls who had slept nearby, was enough to convince them that none of us were responsible. None of the men from the other dorm were arrested either. And with no security cameras in the hostel, no CCTV of any kind, there was no footage to tell them who the girl had last been seen with. We were told we couldn't leave the city until some initial investigation had been completed. The girls asked, understandably, whether we could sleep somewhere other than the room where the body had been found. The owner said no to the men's dormitory, but the men who were staying in the hostel immediately volunteered to take their mattresses out to the backyard so that we had somewhere to sleep that hadn't been the site of a young woman's death just hours before. That small act of kindness from those strangers meant more to me than I can properly say. A few days later, the police returned and told us that a suspect had been arrested. We were free to leave Tangier. They gave us nothing more than that, just that we were no longer needed and that we were not suspects. If you found yourself listening to this story and feeling that tight, uneasy feeling in your chest, you're not alone. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever been somewhere that turned out to be far more dangerous than you realized? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. The group of travelers who had remained at the hostel during those few days had formed an unlikely little bond, the kind that only comes out of shared difficulty. Several of us ended up heading south to Marrakesh together, and we had a genuinely wonderful time, especially during the long, sun-filled days when we could keep ourselves busy and distracted. But the nights were different. When the talking slowed and the drinks came out, someone would inevitably bring up the French girl, and the whole mood would change. It would get quiet and heavy, the way it does when you're all thinking about the same thing but none of you quite know what to say. I still think about her sometimes. Even now, all these years later. Telling the story to my granddaughters brought her back to me for days afterward. I told them so they would understand. So they would know that the world is not only full of beautiful strangers waiting to become friends. So they would know to be careful, to be aware, to trust their instincts. It was the most important lesson I had from all my years of travel, and it cost that young French woman everything. Story 2. My name is Joel. And in September of 1996, I was an 18-year-old gap-year student, living in England and making it up as I went along. Most young people who take a gap year go into it with at least the outline of a plan. A route, a short list of destinations, a budget broken down into weeks. I had none of that. What I did have was a very modest amount of money and the strong suspicion that it would stretch a great deal further if I flew east rather than west. South America had crossed my mind, Colombia, Peru, Chile, somewhere with warm weather and cheap food. But the budget was the real issue, and I needed every pound to go as far as it possibly could. Then, sometime in late November, I was watching the evening news when a report came on about something called Visit Myanmar Year. The BBC showed footage of a large ceremonial parade passing before what looked like a government official, not military, more like a cultural display, and the reporter explained that the country was, for the first time in decades, actively opening itself up to international visitors. It was apparently a significant enough event to warrant several minutes on the national news broadcast. But all I found myself thinking, very honestly, was, where on earth is Myanmar? As it turned out, Myanmar was what Burma had renamed itself back in the 1980s. It had a complicated and painful history, initially colonized by the British, then turned into a brutal battleground between British and Japanese forces during the Second World War, then granted a brief period of democratic independence before the military stepped in and seized control of everything. And then, after roughly 30 years of almost complete isolation from the rest of the world, they decided they wanted some tourism. Hence, Visit Myanmar Year. It was being promoted as this pristine and untouched paradise, white sand beaches, lush green nature reserves, ancient temples. The trouble, of course, was that behind all of that natural beauty sat one of the most repressive and authoritarian military governments on the planet, one that had a documented habit of using political prisoners as unpaid slave labor. I later heard that the government had constructed a number of brand new hotels using exactly that workforce, which had given rise to a counter-campaign led by human rights organizations, Don't Visit Myanmar Year. And if I'm being completely honest, if I were the person I am today, I would never have gone near the place. But I was 18. And when I heard that I could live comfortably on as little as £10 a week, that was genuinely all I needed to hear. After a 17-hour journey that included a layover somewhere in the Middle East, I landed in Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon. I didn't stay in one of those gleaming new hotels. Not even for a single night. Not for 5 stars and a swimming pool. I couldn't bring myself to do it, knowing what I knew about how they'd been built. Instead, I found a small, welcoming hostel near the city's Chinatown district, which I booked for the almost unbelievably low price of 80 pence per night. The British colonial influence was visible all over the city's older architecture, but Yangon also had something that genuinely stopped me in my tracks, Buddhist temples unlike anything I had ever encountered. The pagodas of the city were extraordinary, and the most spectacular of them all was the Shwedagon Pagoda. Try to imagine a golden spire rising nearly 400 feet into the sky, covered, genuinely covered, in solid gold plating that caught the blazing midday sun and reflected it back in every direction. In the heat of Southeast Asia, with temperatures pushing 40 degrees even in the shade, that structure glowed with an almost supernatural intensity. It was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever stood in front of, before or since. And since I was among the very first wave of tourists to arrive in the country since it reopened, I attracted a great deal of attention wherever I went. Stairs, mostly. Long, open, unabashed stairs. I didn't mind at all. I had rather expected it, and there was something strangely wonderful about being in a place so recently closed to the outside world that the sight of a foreign face was still genuinely surprising to people. After a full day of walking through the city, sampling whatever food I could find, and practicing my very limited Burmese from the phrase book I'd bought at the airport, I made my way back to the hostel for the evening. From the street it looked rough and unassuming, a narrow side alley, 2 slightly crooked wooden doors, nothing about the exterior to suggest anything pleasant inside. But past those doors, it was genuinely lovely. Clean, warm, well kept. The man who ran it, whose name was Min, was clearly immensely proud of the place. His wife handled the cooking. His daughter took care of the cleaning and laundry. It was a real family operation, and you could feel that in every detail of the place. Min's English was excellent, and he had a dry, understated sense of humor that I liked immediately. When he showed me to my room, I was struck by how much nicer it was than I had anticipated from the outside. The bed was small but genuinely comfortable. Everything was spotless. The bathrooms and showers were shared by floor, but I was the only guest on my floor, so I had the whole section to myself. By about day 3, I was fairly convinced I had made the single best decision of my entire life in choosing this place. And this country. Part of it was the food. Part of it was the temples and the heat and the strangeness of everything. But the honest truth is that I was fascinated by Myanmar in a way I hadn't been by anywhere else, because the country had been so deeply isolated for so long that it had developed this entirely self-contained culture. It was like stepping into somewhere that had existed entirely on its own terms for 30 years. Like visiting a very different version of the world. Even just wandering around without any particular destination, soaking in the sounds and the smells and the texture of daily life, felt endlessly interesting. At night, I would open the window of my room, sit on the edge of the bed with a bottle of local beer, smoke a cigarette, and simply listen to the sounds of the city settling in the darkness. It was on one of those nights that I first noticed something unusual. Late at night, well past midnight, I would see men walking people through the hostel courtyard, out through a back gate, and across the yard to what appeared to be a small outbuilding. A concrete structure with a heavy iron door and one of those narrow letterbox-style peepholes set into it. The building itself couldn't have been much bigger than a garden shed in terms of floor space. But men would lead people to it, knock, wait while the peephole slid open, exchange a word or a look with whoever was on the other side, and then be admitted along with whoever he had brought with him. And from my vantage point at the window, it did not look like anyone ever came back out. If you're watching this late at night and something about this is making the hairs on your arms stand up, you're exactly where this story is going. Go ahead and like this video so others can find it, and share it with a friend who loves a good late-night story. One night, Min took what I counted as 20 to 30 people out to that small concrete building in the space of a single evening. That was more people than the building could possibly hold based on its visible size, which led me to think, and I became more and more certain of this as time went on, that there must be stairs inside leading down to something below ground. A basement, maybe. Something that couldn't be seen from the surface. Then, the night before I finally decided to ask about it, Min caught me watching from the window at 1:30 in the morning. He stopped in the yard, looked up at me with a flat, unreadable expression, held my gaze for a moment, and then simply continued walking. He didn't wave. He didn't look embarrassed. He just looked at me, filed the information away, and moved on. The following afternoon, when I returned from lunch, Min was behind the front desk. As I approached, he gave me a mildly amused look and commented, in that understated way of his, that I had done a bit of spying the previous night. He wasn't angry. He said it the way you might tease a curious child. I confessed without much resistance that yes, I had been watching, and that I was curious about what was happening out there in the yard at night. Min told me he hosted gambling evenings down there. Nothing serious, he said. Just a few friends playing cards for a bit of pocket money. A casual arrangement. Naturally, being the curious and frankly reckless young man that I was, I immediately asked if I could join in one evening. Min laughed and told me politely that he preferred to keep business and friendship separate. No offense intended, but he didn't mix the two when money was involved. I pushed. I suggested I could buy my way in, that I'd pay whatever was appropriate to sit at the table for a few hands. Min turned that down too, and his politeness was beginning to develop an edge. He asked me, quite clearly, to stop asking, not as a threat, but because he genuinely didn't want our good relationship to become strained. He'd been a wonderful host. His wife's food was genuinely exceptional. I didn't want to upset that. So I backed off. But the curiosity didn't go away. It grew. Especially after the night I watched from my window and saw Min step outside with a man who was crying. Not quietly, this man was sobbing, speaking in low urgent whispers that gradually grew louder until Min said something sharp and definite and the crying man went quiet. Then Min reached into his pocket, pulled out what looked like a substantial roll of banknotes, peeled several off, and tucked them into the front pocket of the man's shirt. But the crying man didn't seem interested in the money at all. He kept murmuring things in Burmese, hunched and miserable, while Min stood there impassive. I watched that exchange and thought, this is not a game of cards among friends for a bit of loose change. Something much higher stakes was happening behind that iron door. Now, I want to be fully transparent. What I was thinking at this point, in hindsight, sounds absolutely mad. But I was 18 years old. I had been wandering around one of the most isolated countries on the planet for 10 days, and I was intoxicated by the strangeness of everything. And so, after letting that blister of curiosity fester for another day or two, I made a decision that the mature, sensible 47-year-old version of me would absolutely not endorse. I went to one of the only 2 banks in all of Myanmar that could process international accounts and withdrew exactly 1 million kyat, which, at the exchange rate of the time, worked out to somewhere between 50 and 60 pounds. The bank teller counted it out with an expression I can only describe as quietly bewildered, and I tucked the whole bundle into my pocket and spent the rest of the afternoon finding things to do while I waited for the sun to go down. My plan was this: when Min started leading his guests out to the concrete outbuilding, I would wait until a decent number of people had gone in. Then I would go out there, knock on the door, ask for Min, and offer him 1 million kyat in exchange for letting me inside. In my head, I had constructed a vivid picture of what I was going to find: some kind of wild, atmospheric underground gambling hall, men crouched over ancient and mysterious games of chance, smoke drifting through the room, the whole thing dripping with the exotic and forbidden atmosphere that a teenager who's read too many adventure novels tends to imagine. Looking back now, I'm almost embarrassed by how naive all of that was. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, right on cue, Min began walking guests through the yard. I watched from the window until I counted roughly 24 people making their way to the shed. Then I drank half a bottle of beer in one go for what I generously called courage, made my way downstairs and out into the yard, and crossed toward the iron door on unsteady legs. By the time I knocked, my heart was going so fast I could feel it in my ears. The letterbox peephole slid open. A pair of very angry-looking eyes appeared and their owner said something to me in Burmese that was clearly not a welcome. I just kept saying Min's name, hoping the word would translate well enough. The peephole slid shut again. I stood there for a moment in the dark, money in hand, wondering if I had just made a complete fool of myself and whether Min was about to ask me to leave the hostel entirely. But then the idiot teenager in me decided to knock again. And the door swung open, and I was face to face with a very unhappy-looking man. It was frightening. Genuinely frightening, seeing this particular shift in someone I had come to think of as warm and kind. I had no idea what to say, so I held out the roll of banknotes and told him he could have it in exchange for letting me in. He looked at the money. He looked at me. And then, after a very long moment, he told me to put the money away and to save it for betting. I was elated. I could barely believe it had worked. But before we went another step, Min made his position very clear. If I spoke to anyone, and he meant anyone, about what I was about to see, he would make a phone call and ensure that the police found certain pills in my luggage when I tried to leave the country. He didn't specify what kind of pills. He didn't have to. The message was perfectly clear. If I went to the authorities about what happened in that basement, he would see to it that I was the one who ended up in serious trouble. I had the presence of mind to wonder, briefly, why he was making those threats if all he was running was an informal card game. But Min was standing in front of me and I needed to give him an answer, so I told him I understood. I agreed to his terms. I said I would tell no one. I did quietly intend, for the record, to tell absolutely everyone once I was safely home in England. I just planned to leave the Burmese police out of it. And as it turned out, it was years before I was actually able to bring myself to talk about what I saw that night to a single person. That irony was not lost on me. Min gave me a long, measuring look, as though weighing up whether I was trustworthy, or perhaps whether I was worth the trouble. Then he told me to follow him. We walked past the iron door and into a corridor, and then down a long, winding staircase. I stayed close behind him, the guard watching me with undisguised suspicion as I passed. The stairs went down for what felt like a couple of minutes, far longer than I would have expected for a single basement level. When we finally reached the bottom, we were standing at the end of another corridor, and at the far end of it was a second heavy door. Even from where I stood, I could hear muffled sounds from the other side, shouting, a roar of voices, the particular kind of noise that a crowd makes when it is very excited and very compressed into a small space. Min turned to me before he touched the handle and asked if I was certain I wanted to go inside. And even knowing what I know now, even with everything that followed, I can honestly tell you that in that moment, there was nothing I wanted more. He pulled the door open. The sound hit me like a physical force, not because it was deafening, but because of how sudden it was, how completely it shattered the quiet of that corridor. The basement was massive. Far larger than anything the small concrete building above ground had suggested. It was the size of a school gymnasium, maybe larger. And it was packed, not with the 24 people I had counted going into the building from the yard, but with well over 100. There must have been multiple entrances, a network of different access points feeding into this single underground space from different directions. At the center of the crowd was a ring. A pit, really. Roughly circular, marked off from the crowd by a low barrier. A man inside was hosing something down through a grate in the floor. Even from where I was standing, I could see the color of what he was washing away. It was red. I didn't have time to stare. Min was already moving, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times, and I had to keep up with him. Every person we passed seemed to turn and look at me. The sight of a foreign face in that space was apparently extraordinary enough to pull attention away from whatever was happening in the ring. I can only imagine what I looked like to them. Probably pale, probably wide-eyed, probably looking exactly as lost and out of place as I felt. Min led me toward a group of bookmakers stationed near the edge of the crowd. I was fully expecting to see dogs. Everything I had registered, the ring, the blood, the security, the scale of the operation, had pointed me in that direction. A dog-fighting operation. Horrifying, illegal, exactly the kind of thing you'd run underground in a heavily controlled country. But then 2 young Burmese men were led into the pit. One wore a white headband. One wore a black headband. Min smiled for the first time since I had found him at the iron door, and shouted something at me over the noise of the crowd. Around us, people rushed forward to get a better look at the 2 young men in the ring. And then the betting began, frantic, urgent, the bookmakers barely keeping up with the volume of it. When the first rush slowed, Min asked me which man I wanted to back. Black headband or white headband? I told him I couldn't really bet without knowing what they were about to do. Min said it didn't matter. This wasn't a test of strength or skill, he told me. It was a game of pure chance. Some gamblers claimed they could read the outcome before it began, but Min dismissed that as complete nonsense. I handed over 10,000 shot. Min asked me who I wanted to back, and I told him to recommend someone. Without hesitating even a second, he said, black headband. I placed my bet. And then, as I watched him hand the money to the bookmaker, a film started coming back to me. A film I had seen some years before. A film called The Deer Hunter. I remembered watching it and thinking that what it depicted could never actually happen in reality. And standing in that basement, I had a similar thought. Almost identical, in fact. The same disbelief. The same instinct that what I was seeing was too extreme to be real. I asked Min the name of the game the 2 young men were about to play. I think part of me was hoping he'd name something I'd never heard of. Some obscure local blood sport with its own rules and culture that I could convince myself was fundamentally different from what my mind was already telling me it was. He leaned close so I could hear him over the crowd, and he said, Russian roulette. I stood there in that basement with 100 strangers surging around me, and for a moment I couldn't think of a single useful thing to say or do. What I actually said, out loud, to the man standing next to me, was, "This is just like the deer hunter." Min had never heard of the film. He looked at me like I had said something in a language he didn't recognize and asked me to repeat myself. I told him it didn't matter. And looking back now, I think that comment, that bizarre, deflecting, absurd little comment, was my brain's attempt to protect itself. To wrap what was happening in a layer of fiction so that it felt less real. Less terrible. Less like something I had actively chosen to be present for. It didn't work. When the reality of what was about to unfold settled fully on me, I understood exactly what a profound mistake I had made in being there. But leaving wasn't a real option anymore. Turning to Min and demanding to go would only have made things worse. He had warned me, more than once, not to get involved. I had ignored every one of those warnings. And so I kept my mouth shut, and I watched. A referee of sorts moved around the outside of the pit, showing the crowd the revolver he was carrying, demonstrating that the bullets were real, that nothing was faked, that this was exactly what it appeared to be. He moved slowly, calling out to the crowd. When he completed his circuit, the two young men stepped forward to face each other. The referee spoke. The crowd fell quiet. He tossed a coin. He consulted one of the contestants. Based on their answer, he handed the revolver to one of them, the man in the black headband. Black headband would pull the trigger first. I have lived through a number of frightening moments in my life. And I will say without any qualification that what followed was the most surreal, the most deeply wrong-feeling thing I have ever witnessed as a human being. Standing there with my hands at my sides, watching a young man raise a loaded revolver to his own temple, I had two simultaneous and completely contradictory thoughts. The first was, this cannot be happening. The second was, it is happening, and you need to leave right now. I did neither. I just stood there. One bullet in the cylinder. The referee spun it. The cylinder slammed shut. Black headband raised the gun to his head, his hand trembling visibly, his eyes scrunched closed. He pulled the trigger. A dry click. The room erupted, cheering and shouting in relief and the particular release of tension that comes from a crowd that has been holding its breath for 30 seconds. Min leaned in to explain the structure of it to me. There were different bets for different outcomes, for who, and when, and whether anyone was killed at all. The rules were straightforward, each man took 5 shots, with the cylinder spun fresh before each trigger pull. If someone was killed, they were killed. But more often than not, they weren't. This was not, Min explained, like the fictional version of the game where death seemed to be the intended outcome. It was gambling. High stakes, extraordinarily dangerous gambling, but gambling nonetheless. The contestants had their own bets too, on their own survival, or on their opponent's death, or even, in some cases, on their own. Some men bet on themselves to die, knowing that if the worst happened, their family would receive something. I don't doubt for a moment that some of the people in that room wanted to see someone die. I believe Min may have been one of them. But the structure of the event wasn't built around that desire. It was built around chance. The white headband took his turn. The cylinder was spun. The gun was raised. Another dry click. The crowd roared again. The revolver went back to the black headband. Spun again. Click. By the time each man had taken his 4th shot without incident, I had begun to breathe a little more normally. The prospect of watching someone die in front of me had seemed absolute at the start, and now it was beginning to feel, not comfortable, never comfortable, but somehow less inevitable. Min had said it was rare. And as the game progressed, I began to believe him. Then the man in the black headband reached his 5th and final shot. And he hesitated. Both men had been shaking throughout. But by the 5th trigger pull, the trembling was severe. Black headband raised the gun to his temple, held it there, and then his hand dropped. He lowered the weapon. He said something in Burmese, quietly at first, and then the crowd caught it, and the mood in the room shifted instantly from excitement to something uglier. He raised the gun again. His hand shook so badly the barrel rattled against the side of his head. And again, his arm dropped. The words he spoke might have translated to something like, "I can't. I simply can't." The crowd went from silence to fury in seconds. The referee shouted at him. Two men, security, obviously, jumped down into the pit. Black Headband backed away with his hands raised, the gun hanging from one hand, pleading in Burmese with anyone who would listen. They rushed him. He didn't fight them. He just dropped the gun and raised both hands in surrender. They pinned him to the concrete floor. I had started wondering what happened in this situation when the referee answered the question for me. He picked up the revolver, spun the cylinder, walked over to where Black Headband was pinned to the ground, and pressed the barrel directly to his forehead. He pulled the trigger. A dry click. The crowd burst into laughter, the particular kind of laughter that comes with relief and contempt mixed together, at the discovery that the man had been terrified of an empty chamber. Even White Headband was laughing, still chuckling as the referee handed the revolver to him for his own fifth and final shot. Black Headband was still lying on the floor. He had, in the chaos of the moment, lost control of his bladder. He lay there in a puddle of shame while the crowd around him mocked what had just happened. White Headband raised the gun. The room went quiet. He was still smiling as he pulled the trigger. And then there was a sound that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, and the top of his skull simply ceased to exist. The crowd's reaction was immediate, and it was the most chilling part of all. There were cheers from some. Curses from others. The rattle of betting slips being waved in the air. A matter of profit or loss, nothing more. As though what had just happened was simply the result of a horse race or a card game. I stood there staring at what remained of the man in the white headband until Min's voice was right next to my ear, very calm, saying, "Congratulations. You won." That was the second time I saw him smile that evening. He had seen the look on my face and understood exactly what it meant. He told me to follow him so I could collect my winnings. I shoved the bundle of money into my pocket without looking at it, and when we were back outside in the cool air of the yard, walking across the dark concrete toward the hostel, Min reminded me of our arrangement. Not threateningly. Not loudly. Just calmly, methodically, as if ticking off an item on a list. He asked whether I remembered what we had agreed about discretion. I told him I remembered. He said nothing else. He wished me a good night at the door and went back inside. I was in no condition to sleep. Instead, I went out into the city and I drank. I drank until I could barely walk. And somewhere in the course of that night, I gave away every last shot of those winnings, pressed into the hands of strangers, of beggars I passed on the street, piece by piece until it was all gone. I wanted nothing to do with that money. I had no idea what else to do with the feeling of it in my pocket. I nearly got myself arrested trying to sleep on the steps of a temple at some point in the early hours. The police drove me back to the hostel, and thankfully there was no one at the front desk when I stumbled in. I went up to my room and collapsed onto the bed. The hangover the next morning was extraordinary in its brutality. I didn't stop being sick until around midday. I lay there between bouts of it, staring at the ceiling, wishing I could unremember everything I had seen. Min was cheerful and warm when I finally made it downstairs to eat something, exactly as he always was, and he said nothing about the night before. I ate in silence and went back upstairs. That evening, I walked to a Buddhist temple on the edge of the city and sat there until very late, in the warm heavy air, with the sound of the city distant around me. I'm not going to try and describe everything I thought about sitting there. I think you can probably imagine. But I will say that it was the first time in my life that I truly understood, at a bone-deep level, just how much darkness exists in this world, and how completely, miraculously sheltered my life in the green suburbs of England had been from it. If this story is striking a chord with you, I'd love to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to hit the like button so more people can find these stories. Story 3. My name is Devin. I'm from Ohio. And I think this story fits well here, because it is without question the most frightening thing that has ever happened to me. Back in 1999, I took some time to travel before starting college. The Philippines was gorgeous. Vietnam was everything I had hoped it would be. And Malaysia turned out to have some of the finest food I had ever tasted in my life. But it was in Thailand that a fellow backpacker gave me a tip: go to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a small island that sits just off the southern tip of India. And while it shares a lot of India's flavors and textures, it has a very different character of its own. The capital, Colombo, is a dense, sprawling urban filing cabinet of a city, full of traffic and noise. Not really my kind of place. But the coastal towns, those were something else entirely. Quiet and brilliant and sun-soaked, with the ocean right there at your door. After spending a day or two looking around, I decided it was absolutely worth a week of my time and checked myself into a little beachside hostel. That's where I met Mika. Mika was Finnish. And Mika was, in the very best possible interpretation of the word, crazy. He was the most enthusiastic, most fun-loving, most relentlessly social person I had encountered during the entire Asian portion of my trip. He had been in Hokkaido for a while by the time I arrived and knew the place thoroughly, where to find the best food, where the beer was coldest and cheapest, where the surfer crowd liked to gather after dark, and crucially, where to get an outstanding iced coffee. That last one sounds minor, but in that kind of heat, a good cold coffee is something close to sacred. We fell into an easy rhythm, the two of us. Days in the sun, evenings on the beach, late nights wherever the music took us. One morning, after a previous evening that had been more enthusiastic than wise, we decided the only reasonable treatment was a local hangover cure: eggs, prepared in multiple ways, with a generous amount of red chili sauce on the side. It helped, mostly. We walked back to the hostel afterward feeling at least partially restored. The hostel was divided into several communal rooms, each with 3 beds. Mika and I had been sharing a room, and our third bed had been sitting empty since I arrived. But when we pushed the door open that morning after breakfast, the room wasn't empty anymore. We had to wait a few minutes before the occupant returned from the shared showers. And when the door opened again, in walked the largest human being I had seen up close in a very long time. A huge, heavy-set man with bright red hair, dressed in nothing but a towel and a pair of flip-flops. He scanned the room with the kind of flat, expressionless stare that could mean almost anything, and then he set his roller case on the bed and began unpacking without a word. Mika, being Mika, immediately tried to be friendly. He said hello, asked how things were going. The man looked up, gave us both the same blank look, and went back to his bag. It wasn't just rude. It was the particular kind of deliberate non-response that makes the air in a room feel slightly strained. Mika, after a moment's thought, tried a different approach. He said one word: Ruski. The man looked up. Duh, he said. Ruski. Mika, whose native Finland shares a border with Russia, spoke just enough of the language to be conversational in a limited way. He explained this, and then asked the man his name. The room's atmosphere shifted in a way I couldn't quite follow since I don't speak Russian, but Mika's body language changed. He raised both hands in a kind of calm, backing off gesture, and suggested we leave. Outside, he filled me in. When Mika had asked the man his name, the answer had been the Russian equivalent of, "None of your business." When Mika asked what his problem was, the man told him, bluntly, to back off. We walked down to the beach, found the bar we liked, and worked through a couple of beers while we talked through our options. If the Russian guy was going to be a persistent problem, we could just cut our losses and find a different hostel. Everything was so inexpensive that a lost deposit wouldn't be much of an issue. But Mika also made the very reasonable observation that Russians, in his experience, had about a 50% chance of becoming your best friend once they'd had enough to drink and figured out that you weren't actually hostile toward them. His coldness might just be the default setting before the thaw. We settled on a plan: give it one more night. If he remained a problem, we'd move on. If not, maybe he'd turn out to be fine. We kept drinking into the evening, and by the time the sun was fully down, we had connected with a group of British women who drank with the kind of committed cheerfulness that made me feel proud on their behalf. Mika ended up paired off with one of them, and the two of them slipped away to her hotel room with a cheerful wave in my direction. I hit it off with another one of the British girls and invited her back to my hostel, sincerely hoping the Russian was elsewhere for the night. Unfortunately, we never made it that far. Standing outside on the street, flagging down a tuk-tuk, my companion suddenly doubled over and proceeded to thoroughly empty the contents of her evening in a highly visible and committed manner onto the pavement. The night, as they say, was over. I bought several bottles of water from a nearby shop, some for her to drink, some to help manage the immediate situation, and rode back to her hotel in the tuk-tuk to make sure she got home safely. It was the right thing to do. I was genuinely fine with it. The unexpected bonus was the knowledge that Mika's evening was also about to be significantly interrupted. Rather than spending money on another tuk-tuk, I decided to walk back to the hostel. The road could get a little unsettling at night, so I took the beach instead. The sky was extraordinary out there. Clear and enormous and dense with stars, the kind of night sky you forget exists when you've spent too long in cities. About halfway through the walk, I spotted 3 figures on the sand ahead of me. 2 men were standing. A third was seated in one of the lounge chairs that the beach bars left out. Even from a distance, I recognized the silhouette of the seated figure. The sheer scale of him was unmistakable. It was the Russian. The 2 men standing on either side of him were local, Sri Lankan. The Russian was almost as tall as them seated. And he was very, very drunk. Even across the distance, I could see it, his head lolling slightly, his whole posture that particular kind of loose and heavy that comes with deep, committed intoxication. I was in a good mood, so I strolled over. I greeted the Russian cheerfully and asked the 2 Sri Lankan men what was happening. They explained that they'd been trying to close up their beach bar for the night. But when they'd asked the Russian to move along so they could clean and stack the lounge chairs, including the very one he was sitting in, he had simply declined to move. He was sitting there like a large, decorative boulder, silent and immovable, while they needed to get home. I remembered what Mika had said about him. Maybe he just needed the right approach. I tried everything short of physically moving him off that chair. Reasonable requests, friendly appeals, gentle misdirection, nothing worked. And then, not really expecting much, I said the word vodka. Something woke up behind his eyes. He repeated the word back to me. And then, with tremendous effort and the kind of slow determination of a very large ship changing course, he hauled himself to his feet. The 2 Sri Lankan men were delighted. As we walked away together, they called after us, "Thank you. Good night." With genuine warmth. I started talking to the Russian as we walked back along the beach, knowing full well that he couldn't understand a word I was saying, but doing it anyway for my own entertainment. I told him he was built like something designed for industrial purposes. I told him his parents had probably had him wrestle bears for sport. I kept going, cheerful and idiotic, while he walked in silence at my side, staring straight ahead. After 5 or 10 minutes, the hostel came into view. And that was when he realized there was no vodka coming. He stopped walking. He turned. He started moving toward me, saying something in Russian that was clearly not a friendly remark. I tried to explain, "Chill out, it was just a word, we can get drinks some other time," but he wasn't interested in explanations. I genuinely didn't believe he would actually do anything. That was my mistake. By the time I understood that he absolutely was going to do something, it was far too late to react properly. He was easily 30 to 40% larger than me, and drunk as he was, the moment he got his hands on me, the outcome was predictable. He got me in a headlock and started hammering the top of my skull with his fist. His punches were enormous and they hurt in a way that was immediately disorienting. I was yelling at him to stop, to get off, but he just kept going, methodical and relentless. Eventually, after what felt like a very long time, his grip loosened enough for me to struggle free. But I was drunk, and the moment I got clear of him, I fell straight onto my back in the sand. And he dropped on top of me. Both of his hands closed around my throat. The feeling I had in that moment, I have never felt anything like it before or since. It was a very particular kind of terror. The kind that comes when you understand, with sudden and complete clarity, that this is not a scuffle anymore. That this is not going to result in a bruise and a headache and an embarrassing story. That if you don't get those hands off you right now, you are going to die on this beach in the dark. I grabbed at his wrists. Useless. I threw punches upward at him. Nothing landed with any effect. My lungs were starting to burn. The edges of my vision were doing something I had never experienced before and did not like at all. I reached up and tried to gouge at his eye, a last-ditch attempt at anything that might create even a fraction of a second's distraction. Nothing worked. And then, right at the moment when my body was starting to fail me, when my arms were getting heavy and the burning was becoming something more frightening, I heard a voice somewhere above and behind me shout a single word. Oi. And something hit the Russian like a freight train. The weight was gone from my chest. I was on my back in the sand, rolling over, gasping and choking, trying to pull air back into lungs that had momentarily forgotten what air was. And above me, in a very strong Australian accent, someone was shouting words at the Russian that were emphatic and anatomically creative and extremely to the point. When I finally managed to roll over and get my bearings, I saw 3 men. All of them built like they played competitive sport. 2 of them had the Russian pinned to the sand simply by sitting on him, which given the size of him was actually impressive. The third one crouched down next to me and asked if I was all right, noted that it looked like things had gotten quite serious, and asked whether the man currently being used as a human mattress was a friend of mine. I managed to get out a no. One of the Australians said he'd go get the police. I asked, in a voice that still didn't sound quite like mine, whether I should stick around to tell them what happened. They told me they'd handle it. They told me to go home and clean the sand off myself. That was when I noticed the sand. It was everywhere. In my hair. In my mouth, in my nose. I genuinely don't know how it got into so many places simultaneously, and I'm honestly not sure I want to. I thanked them, though I suspect my thank you came out sounding fairly wrecked, and made my way back to the hostel. Mika was back by the time I got in, and the look on his face when he saw me was something between alarm and complete astonishment. I sat on the bed and told him the whole story. I think it took a while to get through. The next day, we packed up and moved on down the coast. Not because of anything logistical. Just because we both felt, without needing to discuss it much, that we'd had enough of the energy in that particular place. The Russian situation, whether he was arrested, charged, or quietly escorted out of the country, we never found out. We just left. The rest of the trip was fine. Good, even. And nothing like that has ever happened to me again in all the years since. But I still think about it. Particularly on quiet nights when I have nothing better to occupy my mind. I think about those 3 Australian men and the very specific moment when that weight left my chest and I heard that single word cut through the darkness. And I am just as grateful for them today, all these years later, as I was the night they walked out of the dark and saved my life. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight, friends. These stories matter, and the people who lived through them were brave enough to share them so that we can all learn something, feel something, and maybe hold the people we love a little closer afterward. What do you think about what you heard tonight? Which story stayed with you most? Tell me in the comments, I genuinely read every single one. And if you have a story of your own from your travels, I would truly love to hear it. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And hit that bell, new stories are released regularly and you won't want to find out you missed one. Share this video with a friend who loves a good late night story, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the world is full of light. But knowing where the shadows are is what keeps you safe.